Hey, folks, welcome to this impromptu live stream with my friend Samseau from the Rouge V Forum. Now, the topic of this, as in the title, Theology, the Church, and the Locus of Morality. We're going to be discussing kind of what the church is focusing on and maybe what it is missing. And I'd like to start this with a couple of themes that are going to be running through it. Number one is don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. I worry that at times by emphasizing really strict, really absolutist morality, well, it's sort of like if you punish your children all the time, the children are going to rebel. You know, sometimes you need to hold on loosely. And the second aspect is that when you approach holiness in your own life, you become more and more aware of your own sinful nature. Ergo, the irony that the man who is steeped in sin thinks that he's walking in the light, whereas the man that's trying to walk in the light becomes increasingly aware of his own scars, his own flaws, his own mistakes. And this should not be driving you away from holiness as you recognize your issues and your immorality. This needs to be accepted. Sometimes you got to say, you know what, I'm okay with being me. I'm getting better each day, you know, and that's the important thing. So I want to emphasize here, we are not going to be encouraging heresy. We're not encouraging that you just do whatever you want. We are encouraging that you accept your flaws and continue to stand proud. Now, Samseau is a very frequent poster on the Rouge V Forum. He's a member of the Eastern Orthodox Church, and he brings up he's one of these posters I absolutely love because he's coming from a very different place than me. He's very erudite, and I really I'm challenged by his opinions. Is that a fair assessment of you, brother? Would anything else you want to add? Like, what's your emphasis? What drives you to write about the things you do?
Sure, and I'd like to just thank you for having me here, Davis, because I always appreciate other people bringing me onto their platforms and having a chance to hear a real skeptic. Fundamentally, I am a skeptic, okay? But I'm not like your typical skeptics. No two skeptics are truly alike. I am very much a member of the Eastern Orthodox Church. I was, baptized at birth. I like to write on the Rouge V Forum because there's a huge audience there and I have a huge influence. I don't really care about having my own brand, my own blog, or my own fame. None of that means much to me. I just want to see the right things done. I much prefer to be the person in the background pulling the strings as like the puppeteer. And it makes it harder for my enemies to get me, which I do have, even though I do my best to stay hidden. And I was a philosophy major. I wanted to go to law school. I ended up leaving law school because it was such a horrible deal for reasons I'm not going to go into right now. I got out unscathed and I kind of just got taken care of by God. He provided for me against unbelievable odds. And I'm here today to share the things I've learned and the things I see because I have a perfectly logical mind that was steeped in the world's oldest religious tradition. I like to dance. It's my preferred method of meeting girls. And I'm also just I've been an early reader. I started to learn to read when I was like 2 years old. And I've basically crushed a huge section of the Western canon as a result of that talent. So when you talk with me and when anyone talks with me, I'm able to draw inferences from a large volume and challenge them as a skeptic, because fundamentally, I don't really think people actually know what they're talking about, and myself included. That's why it's important to look at any problem from many, many angles.
You need that historicity, which you have from actually reading our class. It's something I've been talking a lot about lately, as people don't know their history. All they know is pop culture.
Yeah, people don't, and it's a shame because I didn't learn any history in school. I graduated 24 years of school, didn't know a damn thing about history. I learned it all on my own in my 20s. I had to do it the old-fashioned way, reading through books, starting with Wikipedia articles, going to secondary sources, and connecting to what other philosophers had written about their own time periods. It was a long, painstaking process that probably took me about a solid 5 years on my own to achieve. And history, by far, is one of the most important subjects, and no one studies it, which is a major problem. It's why our culture is dying, because we're so disconnected from our past.
Well, I took history. I learned very little history taking a history degree.
How sad is that?
They had a feminist history teacher teach me the feminist history of Canada, which is absolutely everything but the history of Canada. And sadly, that is the majority of courses. You know, the classics weren't too badly infected when I was there, but it wouldn't surprise me now to find out that they aren't being taught either. That if you want to understand the classics, go to Quintus Curtius's blog. He's the only one that'll be telling you the truth of it.
He's fantastic. Quintus is top notch.
I'm nearly done his book, the Sallust, about the Catiline conspiracy, and it's absolutely wonderful. There are so many applicable moral lessons for the modern day. But you know, that's it. I want to jump onto the focus of this. The reason that I want to have you on is that you said something to me the other day about, and this fits with a lot of stuff that's been broiling in my mind, it's been bouncing around, that you think the church is approaching sexuality in not exactly a position of error, but a position of overemphasis. Could you expand upon that?
Okay, so there's a number of things I believe is fundamentally going on. And, you know, this is very relevant to my everyday life. I teach Sunday school now. I've been teaching for over a year. And one of the things I look through the Sunday school books is their teachings on sexuality, even within the Orthodox Church. I've looked at the Protestant and the Catholic's position. And basically, they're all written for a time that was completely different than ours, with totally different circumstances, different technologies. And I think in a way, it's like Satan is destroying the church by pitting modern sexuality against classical teachings from the church. So people are like, well, gee, I can either have love or I can have God. I can have a woman in my bed. I can have a man who loves me, or I can have Christ. And so people choose what's there next to them. They say, well, this Christly love seems empty compared to a real person, a real human's love. And that's the number one reason I think Christianity is hemorrhaging members today. And it's a serious problem because the older generations don't have a clue what's going on. They can't understand it.
Let me insert something.
They cannot understand just how corrupt and damaged things have become. And I've put the pieces together. It's taken me a ton of work because I notice there's just something never sat right with me. The way that the church taught, you know, Christianity, like save yourself for marriage. And it's like, well, that's good and fine, right? But the devil has fucked up our time. Pardon my language. There are no virgins. What do you do? Like, what good is the advice? Find a virgin for marriage when Satan has managed to get everyone to lose their virginity today through a combination of technology, mass media, and mass education, a triple whammy.
I wrote about this a while back, about how it is such a razor edge of morality with the extreme temptation and the cultural propaganda, all of it. And what you wind up with is the sort of person, generally, 9 times out of 10 when you meet a virgin, 1 time out of 10 it'll be somebody that is very strong-willed and very dedicated to morality, but still wants to be a good husband or wife. The other 9 times, you're going to find somebody that's twisted up their own sexuality into something ugly and hateful, and they won't be able to perform.
Depends on their age. I actually wrote a Return of Kings article about this. Yeah, for those who don't know, I've written for Return of Kings. I helped get that site off the ground. And I'm very pleased with what Return of Kings has accomplished. And of course, Davis, you've written there as well. One of the articles I wrote was, you know, a woman's virginity means nothing. And I purposely chose a strong title sort of as clickbait, but also to emphasize that, just because a girl's virgin, what does that mean today? It's probably because she's just too young to have had sex, or he has too young to have sex. The person's too young. If they're still a virgin past the age of 20, it's either they've actually have strong religious groundings or they have serious issues. And if a woman is a virgin past like 24, it's usually, you mean as a young girl between the age of 16 through 24, you rejected every man and couldn't marry anyone? Like, does that sound right to you?
A man who is starving because there's no food in his country doesn't get any points for not being a glutton.
Right. Right. And that's another thing. If a man's a virgin, is it because he pious or because he's just a gamma or a beta or worse or whatever? He just can't get any. And that's first of all, let's just put this in context. It's a horrible way that we actually have to think about things. We have to think, like, today, sex is viewed as such a cavalier way. Man is expected to have sexual prowess. And if he doesn't, then we assume something's wrong with him. So, just remember, things weren't like that for like the past, I think things didn't start to begin that way until like the turn of the 20th century. And even then, it was a long time coming. It didn't really hit mainstream till the 1960s. But adultery was rampant during World War II. It was already getting horrible at that point. Actually, the greatest analogy to our present day is actually the situation the Apostle Paul found himself in. Horribly decadent. People just fucked willy-nilly back in the Roman days whenever they felt like it, whenever they could. I do believe the vast majority of sex outside of marriage was with whores, though. I don't think people just had recreational sex unless they were in the upper classes and they could afford it. For the average peasant slave woman, she would have to trade her sex away for something because she was always desperate and in a desperate situation. Whoring was just the way of the world. And it still is in many poor countries.
There's a cultural foundational difference that came about when there were a number of natural impediments on the sexual act. So you could aggressively pursue a woman, and a woman could aggressively be flirtatious. However, you're doing this in a small town. You don't have a car where you can go up to make out point and disappear. You don't have all these these easy to achieve prophylactics. You could go out and be an alpha male, to use the game terminology, back in the 1500s or 1800s or whenever. You could go out and be an alpha male and pursue women vigorously and still remain chaste up until the point of marriage. Where areas these days it's so easy to fall in. Like when you put a man and woman by themselves in a room, there's a very good chance that things are going to happen. Okay, and that is our biology. As C.S. Lewis has pointed out, yes, we're spiritual creatures, but we are also biological creatures. We are also animals, and that can't be ignored. Which is what I think you were saying about the older generation completely missing out on this biology, on the extreme temptations, on the circumstances, and what it is doing to modern young people.
Yeah, they don't appreciate the levels of temptation, the way the culture has changed, and also just the idea that virginity is just dismissed. It's completely mocked as a concept. The soul is not acknowledged in any form or shape within our education system. Talking about the soul is like talking about...
Our education system teaches that you were born that way, that you can't help your temptations and you just need to indulge in them. That's modernism. It's the exact opposite of
sex ed has the implicit assumption that you're going to have sex, so here's how to do it safely, quote unquote safe. Of course, this just turns women into sluts from an early age, and they're fucked for life. And because of this, and because of the school culture, which encourages early sex, and because they all gravitate to alpha males, it means the vast majority of men get fucked over bad, and the vast majority of women get destroyed. So we're in a situation where the women have been trashed. Okay? The men the alpha males, they get to indulge, but they're not necessarily to blame. A lot of them are, but I think most of them don't even know what the hell's going on. They're just taking it as it comes. Why wouldn't they, right? If someone throws money at you, why wouldn't you take it? It's the same thing. It's pretty obvious to me that the betas, right, in which everyone is born a beta. Okay, there's no really the quote unquote natural alpha males in schools are just the guys who grow up faster. Everyone's born a beta and dies a beta. Your life follows a natural arc. All men's lives have the same arc. So the betas in school who are left without anything because they're just growing at a normal pace while the women are gravitating to the top guys and losing their virginities to the same groups of men, leave the betas with no choices if they want to be pious.
Well, and the way that it's orchestrated, the way that it's vocalized, well, it becomes feminism 2.0, where the woman gets destroyed by the alpha males that she's been throwing herself at, right. But she blames the invisible betas. The betas are the ones that are blamed for it and told that you betas need to stop acting like alphas. You need to stop being entitled.
Well, that's only later.
More beta.
That's only later. See, no. In modern culture, they like the women are 30. They're like, where did all the good men go? You know, we give away sex too easy. You know, they've realized they fucked up way after the fact. And it started with their parents. Their parents did an awful job, and their parents did an awful job. And it goes back to the 10 Commandments. Your sins will be visited upon your third and fourth generations. Hello. That's how God works. Is it fair? Not from our point of view, but from God's point of view, there's a purpose to these things. So a lot of the things we see today started generations ago and came from horrible teachings, and it poisoned the culture, and the teachings about sex, where it started with just adultery, and then it ends with forget marriage, just be a slut, be promiscuous, have fun, settle down if you happen to meet someone. It doesn't matter if you have kids. It doesn't matter if you get married. That's where we're at now. See how fast things degenerated. It only took about I'd say it really started in the 40s. And I think the poisonous atmosphere of World War I and World War II actually was also horribly sinful. And I'll be talking about that. Like the greatest analogy to today's world within sexual terms is like World War I or World War II. At the rate women destroy themselves was no different than the way men were destroying themselves, murdering each other in the name of some bullshit country. It was just as sinful, but for different reasons. So anyways, it started with the wars. It ended with mass adultery. And now it's corrupted itself into a degenerate culture that has no more marriage and love. And for that matter, very, very little respect for God. So, but meanwhile, the church, rather than understanding the great forces at work here and being practical about it, the church still clings to some dogmatic. It clings to a dogmatic view that, we just got to say, okay, guys, sex outside of marriage is bad. Even though it's like, well, what are they supposed to, what are the great masses of betas who have no virgin women? What are they supposed to do? They're supposed to wait until marriage with these skanks. We know right away why that's a disaster. And we don't need the Bible to tell us that either. There's nothing in the Bible about this kind of situation. See, Satan fundamentally knows what the Bible says. So he creates loopholes and puts people in situations that has no clear answer in the Bible. So then you're forced to use your judgment. You're forced to use your own spiritual nature to help guide you through it, which of course, without like any kind of like, I think really guidance from the church on these difficult matters, because fundamentally it should be the priests who help guide the flock through these difficult matters. People aren't going to be able to figure it out. They're just going to give up on the faith, and then they go to hell. The church is to blame because they did not properly, they were outsmarted by Satan. They were outsmarted. They were put in a situation they could not understand or cope with. And the Catholic Church in particular is very vulnerable because they've always emphasized their priests not to get married. So they are completely disconnected from the realities of the dating world and the marriage world, and they can't understand what the men and women are going through. But it's, you know what? It's still really bad in the Protestant church, and it's still really bad in the Orthodox churches. Although I think the Orthodox churches tend to have a higher amount of virgins, maybe just a bit more, but not even close to enough to satisfy all the virgin men out there. So, of course, the virgin men, they're left frustrated until they finally snap and say, fuck it, I need to get laid. I am not a monk. And by the way, 99% of men will never be monks. God did not make us that way.
And then when they do that, they suddenly get alienated from the church.
Right. They say, well, geez, I'm being told I'm a huge sinner just because I'm a man.
It's not like they were getting married at 16 like we used to. You know, when those urges started becoming dominant in the human
and they take the Apostle Paul's teachings completely out of context. The Apostle Paul was writing in an age of slavery, for Christ's sakes, right? He was writing in an age where the father could just marry his daughter off and the daughter had virtually no say. Of course you should wait for marriage, right? Why wouldn't you? Go talk to a good man, talk to a good family. If you've got the money and ready to live a family life and you convince that father that you'll be an excellent choice for his daughter, then you get married. And that's what everyone was doing. If you were even, and you didn't have to be like, you know, a college educated mastermind. You could be just a regular guy with a regular job. You would be a fisherman. You could take care of horses. You'd smash steel around and make swords, whatever. There was a million ways to make a living and provide for family. It was the choice of avoiding whores back then really was a matter of, like, you know, I would say not watching porn. Porn today is sort of like how it was back then. If you wanted, you could choose to go to the forum at night, right? That's why they call them fornicators. By the way, that word fornicators, that's a mistranslated word. It only means whoring. I know it gets put around, especially in the Catholics. Their translation of fornicator means to have sex in general, but that somehow got misinterpreted over time. Sometime around St. Thomas Aquinas, to the best of my knowledge, it originally meant forum, right? That arch was called something like a fornix or something in Latin. So those who were hanging out under the arch in the forum, those were where the whores hung out and solicited sex from other men for, you know, cash and prizes or whatever. So the word fornicator actually just means whoring. The word slut doesn't really appear in the Bible, but people would argue, you know, what's the difference between a whore and a slut?
There's an article that I tweeted out earlier today about a man who escaped homosexuality, but not without a lot of scars. It's a very brutal article to read, but in it he writes about this wrong-headed pursuit of God through sodomy, about all of the vicious physical damage that came along with it, but how there was this hunger for male acceptance being orchestrated in a completely incorrect manner. So when we're talking about the fornicator, it's a very similar thing as this guy going to the bathhouses, where the fornicator is constantly seeking God through a whore's vagina. You know, and he's getting the physical rewards of that, the dead children and the STDs from it all. It's a compulsive behavior as opposed to the romance of grabbing a girl and taking her onto the dance floor.
And it's also there's another difference too, right? A whore will have sex with anyone if the price is right. She'll have sex with an old man. A slut actually has lust for you, right? So you can obviously see the difference. And I did manage to find something in the Christian tradition which supports this view. It's a Saint Mary of Egypt, if anyone wants to look this up.
Please tell her story, because you've done a lot. Now, you've done a lot of this research with one of your priests as well, haven't you? Like, could you get a bit of backstory to this?
Excellent, pious, holy priest. He gets no recognition, and that's how you know he's the man. Okay, that's how you know this guy walks with God. He takes care of bums in his church all the time. His church is broke all the time. This guy walks with God every single day. It's amazing. I have an amazing priest. he doesn't get nearly the recognition he deserves. And that's pretty much like the mark of piety, by the way. So Saint Mary of Egypt was a woman who lived in Egypt sometime around, I think around the 300s, and after Constantine, okay, when Christianity was really becoming popular. Now, I see someone say a slut works for free. True, a slut works for free, but does that mean a woman who marries is a whore with a higher price? Right? Actually, saying a slut works for free is actually a higher act. In a way, when you teach, when you give charity, you're giving away for free. Isn't that a virtue? Something for free is a virtue. Money is sin. Money is bad. If you have to do things for money, then you're not acting for your neighbor, which is the number 2 commandment. It is, you got to live for your neighbor. If you don't live for your neighbor, then you're not with God. Okay. So anyway, Saint Mary of Egypt is, she apparently, I don't know what happened. She was born to a single mom or just a messed up family. She ran away from home and just became a crazy, crazy slut. She would just fuck guys at random all the time. I don't know how the hell she survived. She basically just was addicted to sex from birth, is like the best description you can get. And she managed to steal away onto a ship headed to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And she fucked her way across the ship, fucked her way across the Mediterranean. It's an unbelievable account to read this, by the way. If you read it online, it's pretty unbelievable. She gets to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. She can't get in. She's held back by an invisible force. And then she realizes she's been living a horrible life, and she has a complete breakdown. And she apparently sees the spirit of the whole of Saint Mary, and she apologizes and vows that if she would be let in, she would turn against her old ways. And she does. She repents right there and then. She's no longer held by the force. She goes into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, has amazing conversion, hears a voice in her head to say, live out in the desert of Egypt. And apparently, like in this, when Christianity was becoming popular, there was tons of monks just like headed out into the desert to live like a pious life. It's pretty incredible. There were like thousands of them doing this back then. You really wonder how the hell they survived, but I haven't like looked into it. My priest talked about this. There's books about it called like Cities in the Desert, just entire communities of monks living in the deserts of Egypt. So she just lived out in the desert, and God somehow provided for her. She was eventually discovered by another group of monks who were living out in the desert, and she was like basically naked, and her skin was almost totally black because she was been exposed to the sun for so many decades. And she said she had a vision to tell her story before she died, and she told the whole story of what I just told you. And what the key point of this whole story is that she says at one point, she goes, she says in her defense, she's telling her story of her rampant sluttery. She goes, I never took any money. And this is a venerated saint, venerated of the Orthodox tradition, one of the earliest women saints of the early church. So she makes the distinction right there and then between slut versus whore. Therefore, I am inclined to disagree with the idea that, even if you have sex outside of marriage just for lust, you're still a whore. I disagree. There's no money involved, and that's a big deal. And this woman who survived out in the desert, had her story passed down to all these monks who totally believed her, and they witnessed miracles with her. They said she was buried by a lion who helped the monk dig her grave and then walked away peacefully without attacking the monk, right? Crazy miracles, right? This, in my opinion, is a clear indication that there's a major difference between sluttery versus whoredom. And I think today's women are basically all Saint Marys of Egypt. They've been lied, they've been misled, they've destroyed themselves spiritually, they're unable to bond, but they're not fundamentally whores. And I don't think they want to be whores, but in a way, in the way our current culture is headed, I do notice prostitution is on the rise with stuff like seekingarrangement.com and stuff like that, because the end game of the sexual revolution with women just fucking all the time just for guys that they like, the end game of that is love dies, and then women just have, it goes back to the old ways. They only have sex with you if you can give them something, especially because the problem with rampant promiscuity is that there's no more birth rates. There's no more marriages. There's no more sustainable birth rates. So now the pool of attractive young fertile women sharply declines, and the women, the mercenary type women who realize, wow, I have so much demand for my little snatch, why wouldn't they charge money for it? Why wouldn't they be gold diggers?
The problem with equating sluttery and being a whore is that it completely misses that it's the sluttery that leads to more and more women becoming whores. It's failing to distinguish what is actually going on, and instead taking an overly simplistic, an ignorant view that all these things are exactly alike.
Right. It's a binary
to address it.
Binary black and white. You're either chaste or you're a whore. Stupid. If in reality, it's just like any sin. It's a sliding scale with, the perfect virgin marriage on one end and the shameless whore on the other end. But there's a sliding scale of sluttery, of men who fall to temptation, of adulterers. And then it gets worse and worse down the scale of sexual sin until you reach the point where you just prefer whores or you are a whore. And
and you can see this with the extreme porn addicts, that they outright worship the whores. They want to constantly listen, like they think the whores are the wisest people on the planet. They're not just enjoying pornography to get their nut off. They're admiring these women who would never sleep with them except for money.
Like, why would you want to be with those disgusting ass women? Like, do you know where they've been, man?
They do know where they've been. They've seen all of it, and they still worship them.
It's unbelievable. I think when I was younger, I'd watch porn because I didn't understand. I thought, oh, I'm not paying for it, therefore I'm not whoring. I just get it for free on the internet. But then I'm like, wait a minute. As I grew older, first of all, they're still taking payment for someone, so they're still whores. And just by me watching them, I'm helping propagate this whoring. And then I'm like, and I can't.
If your rich friend buys you a whore, she's still a whore even though you didn't pay for it.
Right. Now, I would say pornography is definitely not as toxic as literally putting your dick inside of some filthy snatch of a whore. However, Jesus does say he who lusts with his eyes has committed adultery in his heart. So why wouldn't it be that he who lusts for a whore has not committed whoring in his heart? I don't see the difference. Do you?
So what would you say to young men that are trying to deal with the challenges of the sexual...
to regular... Look, if you got to beat it, and I hate to be crude, but sometimes I think this is another thing. I think we should be crude. Jesus is actually pretty crude in some parts of the Bible. He didn't use fancy language. He used the slur pigs and swine, which was like the ultimate swear word in Jewish world back then. Don't cast...
The Beckloff loves to point out that when Christ said to the Pharisees that your deeds are as good as dirty rags, he was talking about diapers and menstrual pads when he said that.
Right.
So,
Jesus used
vulgar language.
He said, he used vulgar language sometimes. He said, to the Apostle Paul, why do you kick me in the pricks during the conversion? What does that mean, pricks? As far as I can tell, it means he's kicking Jesus in the nuts by prosecuting Christians like that. Doesn't mean, or it means shins, or it means nuts. But why do you kick me in the pricks, right? Sounds like kick me in the balls, doesn't it?
I'd say so. Listen, it's having studied Latin history, there's a lot of this where it's not immediately obvious to us how vulgar it is, but it is vulgar. It's just that we translate it in a very highfalutin manner to not offend the sensibilities of the 18th century schoolmarm.
Right, and it's not that, because we did go through 1,500 years of domination by the church, and reviling is a sin according to St. Paul. So they tried to clean up language and enforce it, and they did this by cleaning up the language in the Bible as well. But by cleaning up the language in the Bible, they forgot those times that led to the sins in the first place. So I think it's important, especially when adults talk to each other, frankly, about the Bible, they should use vulgar language. And we should understand we're not doing it to sin, but to be honest. So, like I say, if guys got to beat it, use real women. Don't use fucking whores. Find athletes. I would say stay away from models, right? Because they're still being paid to show their skin. Just find women who aren't being paid. If you must beat it to anything, to an image, and find real women first. And another thing I say, so we're going into like my dating strategy. How do you date in a fallen world? Well, because you can't have virgins because they're just ridiculously short supply and the competition is super intense and the odds of getting a virgin is like hitting the fucking lottery. So when you're dating regular women, you can't say no sex before marriage because first of all, let's start with it first of all. If you don't bang a girl before marriage, she's not even going to consider marrying you, let alone respecting you. Okay. Like this idea that if I wait, she'll love me more. That's just not even true.
And this is a physical animal thing. Is
right. If women are animals. If you're not dominating,
aggressive. Yeah. If you're not dominating her the way a man is supposed to, the way it's quite clearly laid out in the Bible, then she's not marrying you. She is going to be she is doing something else. She's either marrying your money or she is purchasing virtue by getting your wedding ring. She's there to do it for somebody else, whether it's her father or for Mammon or for the priest. She's not marrying you.
Right. So okay, I'm going to start with the conclusion and then we're going to work backwards. My conclusion, as far as I can tell, for everything I've learned and read, is that do not pursue a woman sexually unless you're seriously considering that she could be your wife someday. It's as simple as that. Because now let's work backwards. Why? First, everything you'd get judged on is based on your intentions, right? You can still unintentionally sin, but they are not nearly as severe as an intentional sin. Unintentional sins are much easier to be forgiven for. Intentionally sinning, like you rob your friend or you deceive someone else, you create false witnesses, or you steal some dude's wife. If you do this on purpose, then God knows you're a dirty piece of shit. The people always forget the line, it's not what goes into your mouth that defiles the man, it's what comes out of your mouth that defiles
a lot of
the
people
man.
Misunderstand in the Catholic Church the mortal sin and the venial sin. This is essentially the distinction. Anything can be a mortal sin if you do it from full knowledge and full willfulness. If you're being willfully disobedient because I don't care, as opposed to if you are being weak or you're being tempted or what have you. That's the difference.
Right. The hallmark of mortal sins, okay, of the Catholic Church. And I think this is just obscurantism. I think it's a kind of a distinction without a difference. The hallmark of serious sins is you're not treating your neighbors as you would yourself. Right? So when you take a man's wife, hello, you're screwing over some other man. You're obviously a shitty person. If the wife cheats on her husband, she's obviously a horrible human being. If she can't even trust the father of her children and respect him, what chance is she ever going to show to God? Why would God let that terrible person in heaven? See what I'm saying? Like, if God looks at how neighbors treat each other to judge if you'll be worthy of being in eternal life with heaven, because he gives us his power. He gives us freedom of will. So he can see if he should give us more power, which is eternal life. That's really godhood. He's offering us a chance to be a god in a way, to achieve godhood.
We're all trying to become the sort of people that deserve to be amongst civilized company.
Right. So, and that means you don't backstabbing your neighbors. But not everyone's your neighbor. We could talk about this as far, this is, the Catholic Church. You want to talk about, we can do this as a brief tangent. I don't know if you want to do it right this second, but
go ahead.
The Catholic Church,
positive development.
The Catholic Church, the Pope is like, oh, those migrants are the people we need to be welcoming, and we need to love them and love others as we love ourselves. Notice they always change the word neighbor into others, because the word neighbor has a very specific definition according to Christ.
It's peace to men of goodwill. There is a particular individual, unfortunately, in my life, who has very bad will, bad intentions behind him. He is not my neighbor, and I show no charity to him.
Yeah, I mean, you can still love your enemies, but Christ never says love your enemies as yourself. He just says love them. And, that can be interpreted in a million ways. Like, instead of, torturing your enemies to death, you mercifully kill them in one swift blow.
Oh, right.
That could be.
No, and that's the other extreme, is I can't be vengeful with this guy. I can't let my anger, like some justice, some wrath is necessary, but overweening.
If it's protecting your neighbors, you're obligated to protect your neighbors, just as you would protect yourself. But no, hold on. The word neighbor has a specific context from this parable of the Good Samaritan. We know from the parable, and I teach this to 4-year-olds. I teach this to 10-year-olds. I teach this to 18-year-olds. It's like no one understands the parable of the Good Samaritan, which is shocking, by the way. Absolutely travesty. It's absurd. It's sad. It's extremely shameful of our once great Christian culture no longer remembers the main lesson. The parable of the Good Samaritan is anyone can be your neighbor, but not everyone is your neighbor. And Jesus specifically highlights this point by choosing a foreigner, a Samaritan, while the high-ranking Pharisee and Sadducee, who are supposedly of your own kind, walk right by you when you're bleeding out on the road. And by the way, how do you compare the parable of the Good Samaritan to the migrant crisis? Who are the migrants? Samaritan? They're not the Samaritan. They're the robbers who steal you and let you bleed out on the side of the road. That's not your neighbor either. So, of course, the Pope is being a disingenuous, horrible, lying piece of shit, or he's just completely clueless, which I can't rule it out because I don't know the guy. He's either incredibly evil or stupid. In either case, he's not teaching the Bible as Jesus instructed it. He is not teaching Christ's actual teachings.
I think many Catholics are coming to the conclusion that he is as stupid as a serpent.
Right. No, someone says neighbor is a person in my closest vicinity. Late great on the chat. This is another falsehood. Your neighbors are not just people that are next to you. Because we know this, again, from the parable of the Good Samaritan, who is a foreigner. It's right at the beginning of the parable. A certain foreigner, a Samaritan, was traveling through. So the Samaritan is called your neighbor. He is the conclusion at the end of the book, at the end of the parable. Who is my neighbor?
Well, let me provide a concrete example of this. I had that roommate, the alcoholic, that spoke big words about being a Catholic, but would regularly steal, engage, and just any number of things. Terrible human being. And despite, unfortunately, sharing a house with that man is not my neighbor. Down the street, one of the people he despised, because, of course, this guy embraced the most childish form of racism. Down the street from me is a man that works at a corner store. I believe he's of East Indian descent. But this man, he is a Christian. He goes to church regularly. And just as one example, the other day my bank card wasn't working. So he said, don't worry, here are your cigarettes, just pay me next time you're in. That man's my neighbor. This fellow...
Far more neighborly. Yeah, right. And because Jesus teaches that labels are meaningless. A guy calls himself a Christian, calls himself a Catholic, calls himself Orthodox. Who gives a crap? That doesn't mean shit. Your actions and the intentions and desires of your heart are what count. God doesn't care what you call yourself. That doesn't mean a thing. Why would it? Right?
That's the core of being a Pharisee.
Right, exactly. Exactly. They were far more concerned with acts rather than what would say acts rather than desire.
This goes back. related to all of this, because we're kind of talking about the misapplication of the misemphasis, the wrong locus of things, is this emphasis on charity being $1 a day to save a kid in a country that you've never heard of, which, if you actually look at the practice of this, is very damaging for those countries. That is not charity. Giving $1 a day when you're as rich as
hold
they are.
on. Well, actually, it's more complicated than that. But I just want to, okay, so first, what we can conclude logically, okay? I've got such a big rep on the Rouge Forum because Samseau has perfect logic. What we can conclude from the parable of the Good Samaritan, right? We call them, there's a thing called your lowercase neighbor with a lowercase n. These are the people that live next to you. Then there's the Christian neighbor, the uppercase neighbor, right? The uppercase N, neighbor with a capital N. These people could be anyone, could be anywhere, could be from anywhere. They could be that dude in Africa. You have no idea. You don't know. But that's just it. Since you don't know, you could be sinning. You could be giving it to a horrible human being. You could be giving it to someone pretending to be that small child who uses that money without you knowing that it's not going to that child, right?
It's the
you could be getting deceived.
Of charity. It's a pretense of being charitable.
Yeah, it's just the way a lot of people are charitable just so they can show it off. By the way, that's meaningless. If you're just being charitable so you can show it off to people, God doesn't care. That's meaningless.
You got your reward.
He thinks less of you.
You got your
when
reward
you do
here
that.
on earth. Everybody knows you're charitable. Okay, there's your reward for charity. You don't get the reward in heaven.
Right. No, you give in secret. Don't even let your right hand know what your left hand's doing, kind of stuff. So like, if you do know that guy in Africa, though, is in fact your neighbor, absolutely be charitable to him if you can afford it. Charity, remember, charity, and this is what Apostle Paul explains, it's a replacement for the old sacrifice. When you're giving to charity, you're actually giving away your own livelihood for the benefit of your neighbor. That's the kind of sacrifice God loves. That's the kind of sacrifice that gives you honor in heaven. It replaced the old Jewish customs of sacrifice, which, you cut the animal's throat on the altar and in the temple of Jerusalem. That was replaced with Jesus's death. And God showed us what actual charity looks like. Sacrifice for God is what the word charity means. And God gave his own son. Therefore, Paul concludes, we must give part of our own life essence for the benefit of our neighbors, just as God gave his only begotten son. For he was the ultimate sacrifice, the ultimate act of charity. No one can even come close. But as we appropriate it in the name of Christ, we may be forgiven, we may be redeemed, and we may be saved. This is probably as dense as it gets. The parts on charity and understanding how charity works and how it all connects theologically is some of the most difficult parts of the Bible to read. So being charitable to people who are your neighbors is obviously your highest priority. But what about people who aren't your neighbors, right? Is not Samaritan giving to a man he didn't know that was his neighbor? Did he not give him the benefit of the doubt? Right? So we can still say you should still give the benefit of the doubt. You should still be charitable to people you don't know, just as the Samaritan was, because the Samaritan was the good neighbor. He was the paragon of morality. But imagine this. You saved the man bleeding out on the side of the street. And after he's healed, right, he says, thank you. May I come to your house sometime and give you gifts? And you say, well, you don't have to, but if you'd like to, I'd really appreciate that. So you give him your address. He comes by later, a few weeks later, late at night, there's a fire lit outside on the base of your house. There's a den of robbers. They take everything you have, and you see the guy you once saved, right? Wouldn't this show you that sometimes your charity can be misgiven and it can be dangerous? And the charitable act is not necessarily an unqualified good. And this is also another complex part of Christ's teachings. Do not cast pearls before swine.
You have to be careful with those in need, because the majority of those that say they are in need, if you give them a ladder to get onto your boat, they'll ignore it. They keep saying, I need you to give me your hand. But the moment you give them your hand,
Yep.
they pull you down into the water with them.
Yep. You can't save everyone. It's a fact.
Be like children,
same
but wise as serpents.
At the same time, there's actually intense debate within theological circles, and have been for thousands of years, on the levels of charity that is appropriate and justified. Some priests are like, just give it all away. Don't worry about it if you're giving it to swine. It doesn't matter. You're doing God's work. Others will say, well, look, if you give it to everyone, you give it to the undeserving, then you're also hurting your neighbors, because they could turn around with the charity you give them and hurt your neighbors with it. And you're casting pearls before swine. So no, it's not. You have to exercise some kind of judgment. And then they're like, but no, Jesus said never judge. There's those who say never judge, no matter what. I
believe that what he said was, when you judge, judge righteously, for you shall be judged as you judge others.
Well, no. He's speaking in hyperbole. The way I interpret it, okay? There's another thing. The idea that there's like one interpretation that everyone agrees on in the Bible is ridiculous, okay? At the end of the day, we all have to use our own judgment, and we all have to use our own reason to see what the Bible means and how to best interpret it. We can agree on a range of interpretations. There's definitely a cutoff point of what is false and what is not true. And we can agree on, we can say judgment as a whole is bad. But how can you be righteous if you never judge? God calls on us to be righteous. Christ says we need to be righteous. Christ tells us, your neighbor. How do I know who my neighbor is if I'm not judging who's neighborly or not? Christ contradicts himself if we take him literally. That's my interpretation anyways. He contradicts himself if we never judge whatsoever. And then you'll get other guys who get into the nomenclature. They'll say, oh, well, Christ's not telling us to judge. He's just telling us to discriminate. That we're not judging. We're just discriminating our neighbors. We're not condemning. We're just separating, right? And I'm like, you know what? I don't think that's a distinction without a difference. It's just judgment. Christ wasn't.
Quite frankly, many heresies arise from people trying to take the literal words of Christ. Christ is pointing towards God with his words. He's pointing towards the ineffable, that thing that is, and it's within us. We need to use our reason and our judgment within ourselves. And if you try and take it literally, if you try and boil it down to merely a simplified, easy to understand instruction manual, which it certainly isn't. It's far more than just really good instructions. There's far more to it than that.
Right, everything.
You try and boil it
so
down.
Many contextual things.
Yeah, you try and take communism is a basic heresy of charity. You know, it's like, oh, well, you give to your neighbor. Well, then we'll just put everything together and eliminate all private property. There we go. Well, and look how that turns out.
They'll say, who are you to judge who your neighbors are or not? You know, therefore everyone's your neighbor.
Stalin will do that for you.
Okay.
Now, I want to get back to I don't know if you read Anne Barnhart, but she is an extremely vocal critic of the effeminacy in the church. And one of the, Anne Barnhart, she's a bit of a firebrand. I think you might enjoy her work. Now, she is a big critic of effeminacy. And one of the issues I see with the standard teachings on sexual morality is that the easiest way to be sexually moral is to be effeminate, which is a major, major problem. You're not supposed to be effeminate as a man.
Yeah, and we could. There's a few things in the Bible that are classically interpreted as being directed at one gender over the other. For example, sodomy, right? It was never. I asked my priest, I'm like, has it ever been interpreted that sodomy meant, sodomy with women? For a man to have sodomy with his wife, right? Anal sex with his wife, is that a sin? I said, like, no. He said, no, that's not what they're talking about. They always, when you refer to sodomy, they always mean homosexual behavior. That's how it's always been. That's what he told me in the Orthodox Church. It's always been interpreted that way. So when you hear sodomy, it's really just talking about a male sin. On the other, and it's same thing with effeminacy. What does it mean for a woman to be effeminate? Like, that doesn't make any sense, right? Again, this has always been interpreted to be males not acting with strength, courage, and conviction. We're supposed to look at the examples of the apostles, who were the manly as it gets. They went all the way to the grave for their beliefs. They were tortured horribly. They never renounced Christ. That's the ideal of being masculine. It's not just being, jacked, ripped dude. It means standing up for what is righteous, even if it causes you to become a martyr.
Well, it's like we have this dichotomy today where you can be this powerful, aggressive alpha male that gets his way all the time, but he's not moral.
Yep.
Whereas the moral man is a simp who never makes any waves, who doesn't cause any trouble whatsoever, and just goes along to get along. When those are, again, these are the two extremes, and virtue is the mean between them. It is the golden mean where you are capable of great acts. Mm-hmm.
Right? I would say that I would disagree that the man who is silent is being moral. I'm not sure that's true.
I completely, this is my point, that often what we call morality is simply not making any waves. Well, sometimes you need to make some waves. Exactly. Being a coward, being weak, being what have you, being effeminate.
I mean, if Jesus never spoke up, nothing would have ever happened. Is he not the ultimate example?
Quite frankly, look at what he was suffering when he was carrying that cross. He wasn't some effete intellectual. He was a manly carpenter. The guy was a bit of a badass, quite frankly.
In a way, though, no, Jesus was extremely intelligent. And one of the things if you read the Bible carefully, you'll see that all of his teachings are totally logically consistent. Everything is consistent with the two great commandments: love God with all your heart, strength, and soul, and love your neighbor as yourself. Like everything, and then the definition of the neighbor. Everything is in the Bible can be traced back to that. And that's
absolutely. But he wasn't merely an intellectual.
But he didn't know, because he needed to speak to the layman. Saint Paul is the guy for the philosophers and the intellectuals and the theologians. Saint Paul was to give instruction to the church, but Jesus was for the common man. Jesus gave language that was plain, simple, and clear, and timeless. And yet, deep, for the people who are intelligent, Jesus's teachings are extremely profound, extraordinarily complex. So Jesus, as I've grown older and as I've read a tremendous amount of literature, I realize when I read it, it's at once extremely simple and at once extremely difficult and complex. But that's the beauty. You don't need to understand the complex parts to get to heaven. It doesn't matter actually at all. Jesus was preaching to the dumb, the deaf, the illiterate, the sick, the lame, the blind. You think these guys are intellectuals? Give me a break.
That's the beauty of Christianity, is that even if you are unfortunately a part-time theologian like yourself and myself, there's stuff for you there. You can dig into this theology, but you don't need to. It really does have that universal applicability.
The point, as far as exactly, the universalness of it is important, but I think that the complex parts are necessary for the church, and it's necessary for a church to exist to give guidance. Otherwise, Christ would have never created one. So the corruption of the church, which is the topic of this podcast or YouTube cast, whatever you call this, is very, very relevant. Today's church is not helpful. People stay with Christ. Let's just be honest. It's hemorrhaging members. It's falling apart. All churches. Some are faring a bit better than others, but it's not doing well at all. And some people will say, "Oh well, it's just a culling process." Jesus
I
said.
think it's the opposite. I worry it's the opposite. It's hemorrhaging the best members and keeping the worst.
Sometimes, oh, yeah, you're jumping to my conclusion.
I'll tell you, I have a lot. The church in my neighborhood, which I'm about to move from, was very, very Novus Ordo, and it is very difficult for me to go to a Novus Ordo church. There's just so much ugliness inherent in in everything with it.
They're so judgmental. A lot of hardcore church types, like, you're not good enough unless you follow all these little commands. They're basically Pharisees, and
that's the weird irony I will say about the Novus Ordo, is that on the one hand, there's all these loopholes that are allowing all of these toxic traditions, or they're overwhelming the traditions and introducing these little bits of toxicity, and they're very non-judgmental, while at the same time being extremely judgmental. Whereas with the traditionalist churches, yes, it is very traditionalist, and so it's very anti-modern, and yet it's far more welcoming at the exact same time. Instead of judgment, you get empathy at the traditionalist.
Yeah, and honestly, empathy is far more of a Christian virtue than judgment. But
actually, it's similar to how a weak man, whether he be the ruler of a country or a father, will be a tyrant. Whereas a strong man, a strong leader, is going to be very nurturing and gentle with those because of his strength.
Yeah, the point, right, exactly. A strong man will break people's wills so he can point them in the right direction. He doesn't just do it to be on top all the time. It's a very fine line to be a good patriarch.
And you can't just write it down in words. You know it when you see it. You can write down all the words you want, but...
And does that not require good judgment? Like, again, the idea that you should never judge doesn't make sense to me. And I've read that I've seen a lot of monks say, never criticize, never judge, never say anyone's a sinner, because it risks hypocrisy. But I think they're going too far. It doesn't make sense to me. It doesn't jive with what I read in the Bible. And it doesn't jive with how people live their lives. And I also just think, like, if God is this merciful guy, then why the hell would he be throwing all these people in hell for sins which are, like, incredibly small? Okay, so you think this guy drinks too much and now you're going to hell because you think he's a drunkard? Are you serious? That sounds so punishing. Wasn't this the same Jesus who forgave whores and tax collectors? Right? And, there's something people don't know what tax collectors were, like, some of the worst people on the planet.
Yeah, they weren't like modern day tax collectors. Actually bid to be a tax collector. You would bid on a position because you got to make a ton of money doing the tax collecting.
Oh yeah, and tax collectors, they were assigned a certain amount of money to collect. If they got more or less, well, the Romans didn't care or knew. They didn't ask. And they were given some troops and legions of soldiers to enforce their tax collecting. And you had unlimited authority to get that money, basically. So you'd have guys would beat, intimidate, rob, commit arson. And if you couldn't pay your taxes in those days, well, then there was only one punishment. You became a slave, a debt slave. If you couldn't pay your debts, you had to sell your children or yourself into slavery.
A loose analogy for the modern day might be a lobbyist who writes public policy but isn't responsible for it and makes a big profit while doing so.
Yeah, but I think tax collectors were way worse. They had basically unlimited authority. And yet even Christ could forgive those people if they saw the error of their ways. So the idea that, some of these monks with these purity spirals, I think they're admirable, but they're not literally correct. They're not literally correct. So, and the fact that people today get hung up on words and sentences and focusing on the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law is precisely why the church is dying. It's because dual climate and conflicts with the quote unquote letter of the law, which is to save yourselves from marriage, right? The save yourself from marriage thing only existed in a time when there was a patriarchy. There was no way really to have sex with a woman if that father didn't allow it. If the woman was a whore, she probably came from a broken ass family without a father, or she ran away. So getting, just having like a casual relationship, that less than 1%, unless you were in the top aristocracy where they actually had those kinds of relationships. The vast majority of men never ever got to experiencing anything of the sort. And so that's why, number one, St. Paul didn't even have to explain something like that, because there was no, I bet you it never even occurred to him. It was completely outside the bounds of thought. So when I say don't pursue a woman unless you think there's a chance for a long-term relationship, I think that's basically making the best of a bad situation. And I talked about World War I at the beginning of this video cast. World War II. In a war, right, like that, I mean, let's be real. You're sinning, okay? You're killing, you're murdering people. This isn't good. It's not good for your soul. It's not good for anyone there. The pretenses for killing people so that some political rulers can have more power is ridiculous. You are most likely murdering your neighbors, like the Germans and the French shooting each other in World War I, played soccer with each other one night. It's ridiculous. They were forced to kill each other, and if they didn't, they could go to jail. The political systems had become totally toxic. It was nationalism from hell. And yet,
Yes,
were all these men...
Nationalism as a justification for hatred of the Hun, hatred of whomever. But like, look at those old Popeye cartoons where he's just murdering all the Japs. Because they're Japs, they're not real people.
Yeah, right. They always do that in wartime. They always otherize your enemy. But it's also,
which, by the way, when you dehumanize the enemy, the soldiers that come back from that are extremely, extremely traumatized. Because guess what? Your enemy is a human being.
You don't know who you're killing. You're most likely killing innocent people, and that seriously is toxic for your soul.
And that's what PTSD is. A large element of it is
spiritual
damaging your souls.
Spiritual disease, 100%. You've killed people for no reason, but fundamentally, it's unintentional. You're lied to. A lot of these guys are lied to. They're lied to about the nature of the world. They're lied to for the reasons why they're killing others. And they're lied to about who's their enemy and who's their neighbor. And that's why I firmly believe God has tremendous mercy for those men stuck in these hellish environments. Likewise, for the women of today who are in their own World War I, throwing away their virginity for no fucking reason, they have absolutely no clue what they're doing to themselves and how badly they're messing themselves up. They can feel it, but they can't explain it. In a way, the women today are very, very much a victim of circumstance, and the men are as well. And rather than being in a war of men against men, it's a war between men and women, trapped in this and
that they are all
a battlefield,
fighting the wrong people.
Yeah, they fight each other instead of the irony, forgiveness.
The irony that I brought up toward the beginning of this. The woman she voluntarily gives herself to alpha males, and then she feels the pain of that, but then she goes and blames the beta males. And you have the male feminist allies that are there. They're trying to attack the alpha males, not realizing that it's their own beta male nature that is the problem, that they're not stepping up to be virile.
Women have no ability to see the big picture. I've never seen a woman who can see the forest. They see trees. They might see a grouping of trees. I've never seen women who see the forests. That's why there are no women philosophers. They're terrible at it. And that's probably why Jesus and St. Paul made sure that men were at the top of the church, because in order to lead the flock, you need a shepherd who can see all the members and how they interact and how all the pieces fit together. And very few men can see the forest too. It's already difficult enough. Probably like less than 5% of men can see a good big picture view. But when it comes to women, it's like less than 0.05%. It's such a small, paltry number. Women are horrible at it. So there's no point in listening to them. other than to hear what they say as a feeling. Listen to them as feelings being expressed, not as actual logical statements, because it fails every time. So with sex today, right? There's another part of this, because we know this. The churches are far harsher on the men than they are the women. Women, we still have this like culture of, women being these pure little angel snowflakes who must be protected. So just because they're fucking and sucking and doing all these horrible things, no one's allowed to criticize them or say anything. It's ridiculous, right? But if a man says, I can't get married because the women today are horrible.
Well, here's part of the issue.
How can you say?
Part of the issue is that you can sit down and explain to a guy logically why you need to do X, Y, and Z. With women being of the nature that they are, it's not, you can't sit down like a school marm and say, here are the rules in the book. What you need to do is lead them. You need to be a virile man. And if you're an effeminate man, you can't tell that first of all, they're not going to listen to you. And second of all, you are going to fall for their victim routine.
Yeah, that's a big part of it. I think, the original idea of venerating women comes from venerating the Virgin Mary, who, incidentally, was a virgin. Today, we venerate women who aren't virgins. What's that all about?
Well, and they also weren't conceived immaculately, like the Virgin Mary.
But the only way women can even be close to having any sort of honor in the church, the only women who should have that sort of honor, are faithfully married women and young virgins. That's it. Or nuns, committed virgins, right? Those are the women who have earned the veneration. Giving chivalry or some honor to women who are single moms or have divorced or go through boyfriend after boyfriend after boyfriend. I mean, that is ridiculous. And yet they don't want to chase the women out of the church.
The solution to the single moms is not to lecture them on everything they've done wrong. The solution is that you need more virile men in the church to set a standard. When women are surrounded by virile, authoritative men, they will begin naturally gravitating towards positive behavior. When they're surrounded by weak men, that's when you get the
strong men get chased out of the churches nowadays. If you're a strong man who stands up against what's wrong, well, you can get ostracized very quickly. And because of this evil inside of the modern churches, it's another huge reason why it's dying. If you're seen as judgmental, man, don't be judgmental. Don't say bad things, man. And the priests themselves are selected on their ability to manage these women. It's almost like the churches have stopped becoming a place for men to worship God, and it have become a place for priests to become alpha males and hoard over these slutty women into their churches. So they probably tap them on the side anyways. I don't believe that they're doing
male in name only. Okay, it's more of a gamma male, running a harem of prostitutes than an actual alpha male.
Some priests are alphas, but you're right. I think you're closer to the truth with the gamma male explanation.
I've known some alpha priests. We're just talking about these.
And I guarantee you, in every church, there's some alpha males in the scenes, pulling the strings, banging the women on the sly, pushing out other alpha males, and twisting the word of the church for their own ends. 1,000%. And every church in America is like that.
Well, I like a brief aside. I like to point towards there's the psychopathic alpha. There's the traveling salesman that says, I'm in love with you, and then runs off after he gets the farmer's daughter pregnant. That's not the same thing as the alpha that we're talking about. The leader of men, the responsible.
Sociopathic. This is a sociopathic alpha versus a psychopathic. The psychopathic's the salesman. The sociopathic one is the one who sits inside of an organization, backstabbing, betraying, and shit-talking so that they can stay on top of others and get rid of the competition.
They're certainly in control, but they're not alpha by any useful definition.
Right. They're not like they're not good alphas. And they're alpha in the sense that they can get pussy. They're not alpha in the sense that they're leaders of men. They're not alpha in the sense that they stand for what's right. They're not alpha in the sense that they could approach women cold approach. They have to run their little stupid social circle game. But yeah, anyways, so,
Well, what can we as individuals do about this, especially with this ongoing problem in all of the churches?
It's a great question. It's the great question of our time, but I think we're already working towards a solution because we have the internet now. I think the internet allows members of the flock to find each other, allows our neighbors to find each other no matter where we are, no matter what's going on. And in a way, I think that God gave us the internet to help us through these difficult times, to help overcome the sins of technology by letting the righteous find one another and develop a new strategy for this time. I think personally we need a new church sometimes. I really think that might be the answer. Have like an internet church. The congregation logs on Sunday morning, rolls out of bed, and listens to a pastor, and we can talk to each other. It might be time for a whole new different approach, especially if the churches can't straighten their act out. I like the Orthodox Church. I'm reading a Sunday school book, and the parts on marriage and sexuality, it reads like it was written by a woman. It's so ridiculous, some of it.
You know, I've said this before, but it's worth saying again. All of the churches have problems. And I forgot who posted this, but they said the funny thing is that the Catholics and the Protestants accuse one another of their own greatest hypocrisies. The Catholics accuse the Protestants of being okay with divorce, and yet the Catholic annulment rate is nearly as high as the divorce rate amongst Protestants.
Yeah.
The Protestants accuse the Catholics of
do you think God cares if you call
idols.
it divorce or annulment? Do you think he's fooled? Do you think he's that stupid? The dude's all known.
Exactly. The Protestants accuse Catholics of venerating idols, and Protestants are very prone to taking the latest hypocritical big preacher and treating him like he's the second coming of Christ. And all of the stone flinging, all of the attacks on one another is extremely unproductive when we all have problems that we need to be dealing with in our own houses.
I think the Orthodox suffer from ritualism. They're so focused on rituals at the top that they ignore the needs of the people at the bottom, and so they leave the church. I think that's a big problem in the Orthodox Church. As much as I like many of the rituals, they're still, they're for show. They're not really helping people. That's another thing. See, church used to be a place where people would go all throughout the week to discuss their problems, participate with their community. It was the locus of community life. Nowadays, church is just a place you show up on Sunday.
Well, and how many priests are just completely happy with that? How many of them are just happy with like, okay, I've done it. Now I get my whatever, and now get out of my face. I don't want to deal with any of you people. Just read the Bible, read your catechism.
Or it's like a teacher who shows up for work once a week. Or some priests are very committed and they go do services every day, every other day. They're willing to talk to anyone. They spend a lot of time with their parishioners. There's still plenty of good priests out there, but ultimately, people don't take their priests seriously. They don't take the church seriously, and they don't take God seriously. Faith is weak as hell nowadays, and that's especially in Europe where it's dead. I actually went to the Notre Dame once on a Sunday, in 2008. It was, I swear to God, man, and this church could hold 20,000, and yet it was like as big as a church that could hold 200. It was less than 200 people in there on a Sunday in the middle of Paris. I mean, I was like, oh, okay, this place is fucked. That's what I remember thinking to myself. And it was a beautiful ceremony in Latin and everything, and yet no one cared. No one showed up. And now you see, of course, children getting raped by the masses, and no one gives a damn. It's like, yeah, okay, we've entered Satan's world now. This is what happens when people stop caring about their neighbors. Not my child getting raped. That's just a statistic. Whenever you hear that, by the way, oh, that's just a freak incident. That's just a statistic. That's like the opposite of Christianity. That's the opposite of saving the lamb who gets separated from the flock. That's the opposite of loving your neighbor. That will lead straight to hell, not just in this world, but in the next one, right? And yet that's precisely what we see. Why doesn't the Pope talk about all the victims of the migrants? Pope doesn't give a fuck about his neighbors. The Pope is a travesty. But we Orthodox have known that forever. Anytime you have centralized power like that, it's going to be a disaster. An infallible Pope was ridiculous.
Well, every institution is going to be corrupt. This latest Pope really does take the cake, though. We're used to having bad popes because the very first Pope, you know,
there shouldn't be a Pope.
See, wait, I'm not getting into that theological debate, but even by the Catholics, the very first Pope was corrupt. They all have been, because they were all men. And so that's one thing, but it's going to whole new levels. Although I will say there was a positive development where a number of priests and some lay theologians published a document calling out Francis on a great deal of the openings towards heresy that were present in his Amoris Laetitia.
Right, which is nice, but fundamentally, calling out the corruption of the Pope doesn't fix the problem. The problem is you have a Pope. The Pope caused the Protestant Reformation in the first place because the Pope was corrupt 500 years ago. The Pope is corrupt today. At least in the Orthodox Church, we've got hierarchy, which is important, but no one's infallible. No one's teachings takes precedence over another. We treat people as authorities, but not as kings. It's a huge difference. It's why we don't have the same levels of scandals and corruption. Most of the Orthodox loss of membership doesn't come from apostasy. It comes from persecution. The communists murdered millions of Orthodox. The Turks did. The Muslims did. You know, the Orthodox loss of membership has come from the sword, not from people thinking they know better.
Well, the issue with the Catholic Church is that the hierarchy has been captured by...
Right, and that's why you shouldn't have one.
At the end of the day, though, as individuals, all we can do is to continue to state the truth, even when it's not popular, and to be that virile force for good, to live in such a way that we become authorities in ourselves.
Yeah, it's very important. Words have the power of God in them. In the beginning was the Word. All words can change the world because words control people's thoughts. And a platform like the internet, where words can be multiplied by unbelievable multitudes our ancestors could only have dreamed of, I think the solution is staring us right in the face. This technology is insane. The problem, of course, is getting people's attention in a sea of endless distractions. But I think eventually, right, we got to remember there's always something working for Christians. And that is, as the worse shit gets, the more people will be ready to hear the message of Christ when the time comes.
Yeah, the more the middle gets eaten up by either side, the more you realize that you can't be neutral when it's a choice between truth and falsehood. There is no middle position between truth and lies.
Yes, absolutely. The advantage of Christianity is that it's true. It may not be fun and exciting, but it is fundamentally true. And falsehood leads to death and sin. So as more and more people just fade away, waste away, people destroyed by our horrible dating market, sexual market, destroyed by wars, destroyed by money, destroyed by usury, whatever. People always hit that point, that breaking point, which is how Christianity also started in the Roman Empire, because the average guy, the salt of the earth, was just shit out of luck and had nowhere to turn to except these men promising them salvation if they would only listen.
The
and
lies
they
are
took the
being
barbarians.
exposed. The lies
the-
are being exposed one by one.
Yeah,
And
of course.
at some point, it's up to every individual to decide, am I going to keep following this lie? Or is it about time that I admitted it is a lie and this path I'm on is the wrong path, and to turn around and start marching?
Right. And I think if there's a modern church today needs to recognize our sexual climate is completely broken. And it also needs to recognize that there should be different rules, not rules, but different guidelines for men versus women. A woman, if she should save her virginity, but if she doesn't, she should realize she has no obligation to ask anything from any man if she gives her virginity away, less than she's become a whore. And for men, they should be told to pursue virgins, but if they can't find one, then they are forced to grind through the dating game, and that they should never, ever wife up a woman who refuses to not submit to them before marriage. And of course, a woman can't submit unless she gives her body up. We have to tell the men, don't just pursue women for conquest's sake. They're not just sexual objects. They are your neighbors, and you must pursue them as a neighbor and as a woman. It's a complicated process, and it's totally messy. It's not an easy process, but we don't have a choice because women have been deceived into throwing away their virginity, which is why, like I said, I compared this time to like a World War I, World War II, where you have all these innocent men murdering each other for no freaking reason. Likewise, you have all these women who've debauched themselves for literally no reason, like 98% of the women out there. So now you have to figure out a way through this. No different than how could a good Christian man figure out a way through World War I, World War II, knowing that he's shooting at innocent men?
Well, and the solution isn't the inverse, to be a coward and remain behind.
Right? Well,
there isn't.
Would it be better to go to prison rather than shoot at your neighbor?
Well, that's the thing.
Some people would say yes.
Somebody that goes to prison isn't a coward.
Right, but I'm just saying, in today's climate, it would be like becoming a monk and dropping out of the sexual marketplace altogether. Just say, the fucking hell with it, right? That's always a legit option in my mind. But how many of us can realistically do that? Who would be willing to go to prison back in the World War I, World War II days, right? You're still going to serve your country. You don't want to go to prison. You'd still like to have a family. We're still humans. Not all of us are strong enough to do that. And for this reason, you have to pray for the good mercy of God, the good grace of God to help us through our trials and tribulations. And we can easily tie this back to the Apostle Paul, who justified slavery. He said, hey, slaves, love your masters, and masters, love your slaves. Well, I shouldn't say justified. He didn't justify, but he at least
acknowledged.
He acknowledged.
He wasn't an iconoclast that wanted to rip society apart. He was trying to tell society how to become better.
He was practical, is what I'm trying to say. He acknowledged that, he didn't say slavery was this great thing, but he's like, look, this is what we have, and we got to give unto God what is God, and Caesar what is Caesar's.
Well, and to close this
Jesus
out, to boil it down to what you were saying, the practical advice, to sum it up in one, is it fair to say, guys, go out there and pursue women that you could potentially see as wives?
Right. She's attractive is the first step. Then you talk to her. She's intelligent. She's not, a drug addict. She's got her shit together. Take her out on a date. Try kissing her. She's submissive. You don't have to bang on the first date. Probably, which is fucked up, but there's a lot of girls out there who won't be in a relationship with you if you don't bang them on the first date. You're probably better off without those girls.
Yeah, that's actually a great screening mechanism, quite frankly. If she doesn't call you back because you didn't bang her, well, good. She is not looking, despite what she says, despite the outfit she's put on. She's not actually looking to be a submissive wife. She's just looking for the deed.
You definitely want to bang within dates, I think. I don't know. I wish I could give like a guideline, but I've seen things, I've heard things that there's real no rules. I've heard of relationships blossoming out of the first date sex. I've heard of relationships taking till date 10. It's like, I don't think you should worry too much, but you should be pushing for sex after date 1, basically. I think within the first 2 dates, you should still be, even on the first date, you should always push for that kiss. And if she won't give you that, she's just not interested. And it's like, it almost sounds debauched that we have to talk like this, but these are simple realities, the nature of woman, which you will never find in a Sunday school textbook. You will never find being preached in the sermons. And because the church is so disconnected from modern life, people don't see a point to it.
I will add one
They
caution.
hear all
the caution is that because sex is this naturally bonding experience, if you jump into it too quickly, you will wind up overlooking all sorts of flaws and all sorts of warning bells and all of this because you had sex with the person. So again, this is a fine road to travel.
It's no different. Listen, it's just like a war. Lots of innocent people are going to get destroyed in this, and there's really no way out of it. You can be as red pill as possible for guys like us and try and stay rational and cool-headed even as you're dating and banging your way through this minefield. But a lot of guys aren't going to make it. What can we do? We can try and be there for them, but at the end of the day, they have to figure it out for themselves. And the idea that God's going to send everyone to hell when we were born into a situation we had no control over, and it forces us to either be sinners or monks, right? Which is crazy, unreasonable standards.
Maybe you know who this was, but there was a prominent monk from the early centuries of the church who said that, he basically said, like, listen, you know what? We are getting praised as saints for doing all these incredible things. Honestly, in the years that come towards the end, for a man just to be decent will be as much of an achievement as all of these incredible feats we're achieving today.
Of the saints of old. Yeah, because we have 10 times the temptation. We've got way more bullshit to deal with from birth, right from childhood. You don't even get a chance to dissect what's happening. Think of how messed up that is.
Well, and ultimately that's it, folks. Is go out there, be virile, be responsible to yourself, but don't beat yourself up over every little minor failing. In a way, that's its own form of being a Pharisee, of obsessing over the details and the rules as opposed to the spirit of things.
Right. It's the spirit. Are you being a good neighbor? Is this person your neighbor, and are you treating them neighborly? That's the key question. That's what everyone loses sight of.
All right, Sam. So I think that was a great podcast. Do you have any last words that you want to say before we shut her
down? No, not right now. I think that was my last words on the neighbor. But that's the key message. People got to remember that.
The golden rule: treat others well, and be
not others.
Treat neighbors,
not others. Capital N neighbors. It's a big distinction, and it fits in with what St. Paul says about he who walks with the Spirit does not need the law. If you know who your neighbors are, what do you need the Bible for? If you know that they're your neighbors and then that they are part of you, we share that collective soul. You don't need to memorize rules.
If you're riding your bicycle correctly, the training wheels will never touch the ground anyway.
Correct.
So, folks, Samseau is a frequent poster over at the Rouge V Forum, which is one of those really interesting collectives of very intelligent men. There's debate. There isn't groupthink. At least I don't think there's that much groupthink. Very interesting place, which is why I hang out there. You can see his writings there. He might start up a blog at some point. But for now, you just find him posting on there. Folks, I want to say thank you very much for listening. God bless all of you. Deus Volt. This is Aurini out.